Hello and welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. In a time of increasing uncertainty, hardship, and suffering around the world, many of us find ourselves looking to make sense of the world around us. In his latest book, Hostile Homelands, the new alliance between India and Israel, Azad Essa brings to the fore the important relationship between these two countries, discussing the occupations of Kashmir and Palestine, as well as the attacks in India on Muslim and minority communities. He encourages us to not turn away from this critical relationship, expanding our understanding of major players within the political arena. This is more important than ever now, as at the time of recording, Israel's attacks and genocide in Gaza relentlessly continue. Over 22,000 people have been killed, and with thousands trapped under rubble, the real figure is likely to be much higher. Azad Essa is a senior reporter for Middle East Eye based between Johannesburg and New York City. He previously worked for Al Jazeera English, in which he was part of a team who won numerous awards for breaking news and in-depth coverage of the Arab Spring. Azad has reported from across the African continent as well as South Asia, covering politics, development and poverty. His four-part investigation into the shocking behaviour of peacekeepers in war zones, titled "Why Do Some Peacekeepers Rape?", won the 2017 US Correspondence Association International Prize for coverage on UN activities. Azad has also written for The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, The Guardian, among others. Now, before we get on with today's episode, I just wanted to remind you that you can support the podcast. If you like these episodes, come and join me on Patreon and support the show. With every subscription, you'll get access to a monthly exclusive podcast episode delivered right to your inbox. Now, on with the show. Hello, Azad. Welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf podcast. It's so lovely to have you on the show today. How are you doing?
Thank you so much, Samia, for having me. Yeah, I'm very happy to be talking with you. And, given everything that's been going on, we kind of all are oscillating between sort of distress and horror and denial. We can't imagine all of this is happening, for such a prolonged period of time as well. And so it also makes you wonder, like, what's the point of a lot of everything, at this time. So, I'm obviously in a very privileged position compared to others, especially those in Gaza or in the West Bank or in Kashmir or in other parts of India. So I don't have anything to complain about, obviously. But it is a very distressing time.
Yeah, I think one doesn't have to be Palestinian or from a place that is going through difficulty or hardship to feel that, or to have that same sense of grief that we're experiencing. But I'm interested to know, because you are a journalist, and I think what we're seeing from the ground, especially from Gaza, is very young journalists reporting from the front line every single day with like really distressing images and footage, kind of seeing what they're going through. But we're also seeing like a very targeted attack on journalists and other forms of, writers and creatives and institutes that preserve culture. I wondered, as a journalist, what you think and what you feel about that.
I have a lot of thoughts on that. And I don't know if they will be, linear in a way, in terms of, where I'll start and where I'll end. To be a journalist from the global south, so-called global south, from, being South African, being Muslim, being brown, and to watch the sort of disdain in which Palestinian journalists in particular have been treated during this time has been absolutely horrific and very, very hard to digest. And I say this knowing that it's been like this for a very long time. So none of this is surprising, but the level of sort of, I'll use the word again, disdain, in which they have been treated, and the ways in which their bodies have been attacked and assaulted and targeted so outlandishly, and so openly, by the Israeli army, and the ways in which the Western media has ignored or has not used the opportunity to see how journalists, if journalists are attacked in this way, how that represents a larger attack on the society. So they have not used that opportunity to try and tell a bigger story. And that has been really disgusting, to be quite honest. We all know journalists in Gaza. As journalists, we know journalists in Gaza who are working there, and they are, emerging from the rubble, every second, third day, if they are emerging, right? And they're picking up the corpses of their colleagues, of their brothers, of their own families. And they're expected to work, not just, necessarily expected to work from their networks, but they themselves are expected to work. They expect themselves to work, because they know that part of the story is that when you commit a genocide, you try to destroy the people, you try to annihilate them, you also try to destroy the story itself. And when you destroy the story, then there's a vacuum, and that story then is filled in by the oppressors who are conducting that genocide. And so they have to do it. It's their obligation, it's their farz, and to feel as journalists on the outside, you say that, and you correctly say that you don't have to be Palestinian. You don't have to be Palestinian to kind of understand some of these things, but we are able to switch off at night to some extent. We're able to have a meal, able to sleep without bombs going off around us. They don't even have that escape. And for us in our spaces to not be more mindful and to be and not be more sympathetic, or at least more useful, in terms of trying to amplify those voices, has been quite outrageous to watch and to bear witness to. As I said, this hypocrisy has been going on for a long time. It's the basis of the settler state. It's the basis of Western journalism, unfortunately. But we are all very obsessed with Western journalism and Western platforms. So if tomorrow one of us is offered an opportunity with one of these big Western platforms, it will be hard for us to turn those things down, given the power that they have, right? And yet we know what they represent and how they treat people, whether it is themselves or the rest of the world, So it's this power dynamic that sort of is replicated, like the power dynamic of the world and society is replicated through the media. And it's unfortunate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so interesting, everything that you've just said, and just a really poignant reminder that ethnic cleansing and genocide is not just about killing people. It's about erasing the identity and history of a big group of people. It's about claiming that these were never a people, and that for the history to say that this land was always theirs, or there were never people there, or whatever it is, or just completely eliminate them from history. And the targeting of journalists, and we've seen it with writers, and we've seen it with libraries and museums and archives in Gaza as well. It's a very systematic and a very sort of obvious and intentional move. And I think if we don't stop and take stock of that, and we don't realize how dangerous that is, I think it's really harmful for sort of how we'll move forward and how we'll understand and think about this time right now and years to come. And so, thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. I can imagine, you feel, as a journalist, you must feel affinity with other journalists all around the world, almost like a union almost. So I can imagine that it feels somewhat even more strange, or I don't know, like a sense of dissociation perhaps as well. But you've written this book called Hostile Homelands: The New Alliance Between India and Israel. Now, I have many questions about this. I really enjoyed reading it. I thought it was really interesting and informative. And it's been something that actually I have been really concerned about over the last few years, especially looking at the worsening conditions in India for minority communities and in Kashmir. But what has sparked your interest in this area? Because as you said, you're not from Kashmir, you're not based in India, you're South African. So what sort of sparked your interest in this particular area?
Yeah, it's a question that I get asked quite often, as in, why were you interested in the relationship between India and Israel, as opposed to, I guess, as opposed to, an Indian or an Israeli, a Palestinian, a Kashmiri. And the answer is that there are a lot of people interested in it. It's not just me, right? You yourself have noticed that there have been these shifts taking place, that there's some kind of story, some kind of alliance that has been emerging between India and Israel. People have noticed it. Kashmiris have understood that this is something that has been happening for some time. And of course, if they raised this kind of hypothesis that something is happening between these two states and that they have noticed it in Kashmir itself, they're often gaslit, say, oh, you're being anti-Semitic, you're just coming up with a conspiracy theory sort of thing, right? But from my purview, right, from the way the story emerged in my imagination and in terms of my intellectual interest regarding this, as well as, more than that, it was more a story about, how is it that we can figure out how these oppressors are working with each other, right? As a means to give people the opportunity to organize against it, that evolves to a large extent from my changing idea of India. As a person growing up in South Africa, we were told and we were taught that India played a major role in the anti-apartheid movement, and to some extent that is true, right? And in some cases it's a little bit inflated, right? But they did play a role in the anti-apartheid movement. They were one of the first countries to talk about racism in South Africa at the UN, for instance. They were one of the first countries to impose a boycott of South Africa, apartheid South Africa. And as a person of Indian origin, as in my grandparents had come from India, or what was the subcontinent at the time, to South Africa, I was also proud of that heritage, that the people somewhere else that were connected to me were caring about the situation in South Africa. And so that also sparked an interest in sort of global solidarities as well, and the idea of boycott and the idea of sanctions, and that you can act on behalf of another people, to help. And so this is something I was brought up with. And what happened after apartheid ended was that we also understood, like through the words of Nelson Mandela and the rest of the ANC members and leadership, that the freedom in South Africa was not complete because the Palestinian freedom hadn't come yet, or hadn't arrived. And so that was also linked to our understanding, of solidarity and internationalism, as well as liberation. But when I discovered the story of Kashmir some years later as a graduate student, I was quite shocked, to see that a country that would talk about being anti-colonial, that will push these ideas of non-aligned values, to be, Gandhian and to be against apartheid and to be so-called pro-Palestine, would be also running an occupation, right, in its own neighborhood. And I found that hard to reconcile with. And so I went down a rabbit hole of trying to understand what was going on in Kashmir. And subsequently, I became a journalist, and, I started writing about several things. And I went to Kashmir, and I was quite shocked at sort of the militarization and the level of brutality that was playing out there. And I then went to Palestine, and I immediately saw some of these connections, and it was hard not to see. But then the weird thing is that when, we understand that there's a censorship when it comes to Palestine, right, in the Western media. But in those places in which you were allowed to write about Palestine, I found that people were not that open to talking about India, or talking about India's sort of crimes, India's human rights violations, the ambiguities or the ambivalence of an Indian democracy, right? The so-called Indian democracy. And I found that also very disturbing and very hard to understand as well. And so there was a moment where I was working at Al Jazeera at the time, and some of the difficulties actually were there, and it wasn't structural. It was individuals, right, at the channel that would kind of block things, and which is what happens in many places, right? And so, having done some work on Kashmir for Al Jazeera, the Indian government, and this is the pre-Modi period, Indian government came down very hard on Al Jazeera and blocked visas for staff. They summoned our managing director, whom at the time was trying to sort of open a channel, an Indian version of Al Jazeera or something of the sort in India. And he summoned our managing director to come to Delhi and show him every piece of work that we have ever done on Kashmir. Like very, very authoritarian, ridiculous, kind of absurd stuff. And this is all, again, pre-Modi. And so there's, long story short, but there seemed to be a kind of dissonance when it came to looking at India, in the same way that you would look at any other country. There's some kind of exceptionalism when it came to India. And so what happened when Modi became prime minister in 2014, just as when Trump became the president of the US in 2016, this mask for several people who would refuse to see came off, basically, when it came to India. And so it became very clear that India was on this path to become this Hindu nationalist state, that Modi was part of a right-wing movement, and that he embraced Netanyahu quite overtly from the start. And then that gave me an opportunity then to start, looking into the relationship between India and Israel, because it was a lot more obvious now. And so now, to cut a long story short, and so point being that it was something that I was noticing, or I've been watching, but it also meant that others who were not so open to the story would be now more open to it because they could see it, right? And this is the bizarre thing about news and media. They have to see things for them to believe things, immediately, right? They don't want to dig below the surface of it. Now, what happened in 2019 is the crucial part here, in that there was a senior diplomat in New York who made a comment at a special gathering at his home that was put onto Facebook, in which he said that India would be following the Israeli model in Kashmir in terms of building settlements in Kashmir. And when he said that, that was the first kind of open, ambition, that we could spot and we could hold on to and to tie things together. And the moment that he did that, a few weeks later, I wrote the proposal to write this book, basically.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't surprise me that you have been interested in this particular area. Actually, also as a South African, as somebody whose country has had decades of apartheid and oppression, and that has, the country has seen a liberation movement, and it doesn't surprise me that there is interest in this. And I think the sort of the understanding of the situation in Kashmir is globally massively under-recognized, and it's just not there. It's just not spoken about. The occupation of Kashmir is not talked about as an occupation, even though there is military occupation, and there's no other word that really explains that. And I often think that it's because of the mess left behind by Britain, which is what really interests me, and I find almost laughable with former British colonies that are now not understanding or not viewing Israel as a colonial project, and not understanding that it's the same thing, having gone through decades of colonial rule and seen the catastrophe and the disaster that happens or had historically happened when Britain decided to withdraw from its former colonies. And I think when it comes to Palestine, it seems, at least publicly anyway, that the most critical relationship globally is with that of the US. And then the other important relationships are with the UK and France and Germany, I would say. And I think the US is the major one that we're seeing currently, with the US vetoing resolutions in the UN calling for a ceasefire or allowing aid in. And there's a whole load of other stuff that we just don't even know that's happening with regards to how far the US is supporting Israel. But as you rightly write about in your book, we should not turn away from the relationship with India. And I just wondered if you could reflect on what is so critical about that relationship and why we should be more alert to it, and perhaps what the implications of that will be. And you've already sort of, I think, indicated that when it comes to Kashmir.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a very broad question as well. It's a very broad question as well, and I'll try to summarize a few points regarding this because then I don't want to go on and on for hours. Okay, so the first thing to consider when thinking about why we need to, ponder about the relationships that Israel has with other places and other peoples and other governments beyond the usual suspects, right, is because the world is changing to a large extent. The US is losing ground. The US is not as important as it used to be, right? When you think about the rise of the BRICS nations, right? You think about the rise of India, for instance, with regards to its GDP. You think about China as well. There's a shift taking place in the world, and that's why you have these wars that are also taking place with regards to this economic war that the US is now waging on China. They're trying to ensure that China does not become that hegemon, right? That would overwhelm the US. So there's a shift taking place. So that's the first thing. Now, the second thing is that a country like India is considered the world's largest democracy to many people. The problem there is that even though it runs an occupation, it has immense communal fault lines across several parts of the country. You have an authoritarian regime now running it. You have civil society dismantled in many parts of India, as well as in occupied Kashmir. You have the media that's completely, marginalized, or at least they've become stenographers for the state. So democracy in many ways is just a name in India, and it has been for a long time. But the very mere title of being considered the world's largest democracy means that India is able to get away with a lot of things. And it's not just about getting away with it, but it's also about becoming a state in which it's able to justify its actions under the name of a democracy. Because what does it mean to be a democracy? A democracy doesn't mean that you just have a population that votes and selects their leaders. It means that you have institutions that are able to self-correct. That's the point of a democracy, that you don't just have a dear leader that makes decisions. You have the judiciary, you have the media, you have civil society. You have the potential to self-correct when things go wrong. So when you label something a democracy, then it kind of undercuts the possibility for the rest of the world to pass judgments about that place, because they can easily say, hey, we're not North Korea, right? We're not Iran, we're not Saudi Arabia, we're not XYZ, right? We have institutions that can self-correct, which is how Israel also pushes its agenda, saying that we are democracy. And so I think that is one of the major things here, in that with India endorsing Israel and India's relationship with so many of the global South nations, it means that it potentially, this is now putting this major incident that has taken place over the past 8 weeks aside, right? Because Israel has lost a lot of ground, right, diplomatically over this major, genocide, right, that it is embarking on the Palestinian people. But with India pushing or presenting itself as friends to the Israelis, what it does is that it enhances Israel's credibility amongst other countries in the world. And so that's what it does to one extent. The other thing, what it does is that it creates the impetus for other nations and other governments and other regimes to become authoritarian and follow the models of India and Israel, because they notice that they just have to play a certain game of being a so-called democracy, and then they can get away with things. They can align themselves with certain states, and no one's going to hold them to account. So then it becomes a model in that way. So those are the major sort of considerations here, is that while we are talking about the UK, Australia, the US, much of the world, many people around the world understand these countries to be bogus, states, but they have not caught up to the idea that maybe India is one of those bogus states in many ways. They're still thinking of India as, the land of Gandhi, the land of Bollywood, the land of cuisine, the land of culture, the land of history, land of civilization, land of music. Now, the point there comes to my third or fourth point, which is the point of soft power. India's soft power has created the impression in that it's like the mother of the world in many ways, and so it can't be evil. It'll take a lot of work for you to explain to someone that actually, India is going down a kind of Nazi Germany type of route. How are they going to understand that, right? It's very, very difficult. So that's the danger here, is that while we are focusing on the US, there are these other players that are coming on board and sort of extending the authoritarian model and expanding on it. Now, my final point is that what India has also done is that it has been helping Israel integrate into the Middle East. And by doing that, it is now, investing heavily in Israel. And so it's investing into the occupation, right? And so it means that Israel is diversifying the occupation in terms of the stakeholders around the occupation. So it makes the occupation harder to dismantle because there are so many different players involved. So you have the Haifa port that's now controlled 70% owned by an Indian company. And that will now become, or potentially become, a kind of hub in the Eastern Mediterranean. So as the US tries to force out China, or try to force out the supply chains from China, they will move those supply chains to India or to other places, and then use India as a conduit to move those goods and move those, labor and all of that to the Western world, right? So there's a shift taking place, and we don't want to wake up too late and understand that there's a new villain in town, basically, right? And and suddenly it'll be too late.
Absolutely. So, I mean, India, if we look at India pre-partition, one of the driving forces of partition was the fact that there was a will from within the country for, a place for Muslims to live and a place for Hindus to live. And I mean, it's a very simplified thing to say, I know, but I think that there was that will politically and from people as well. Now, my question about that is, if that has always been a desire for there to be a Hindu state, initially when the issue of Palestine arose, and you've had this, you talk about it in the book, we see that India's relationship and India's stance hasn't always been clear. So at the moment, it's quite apparent if you look for it and if you understand it, that India is an ally. But initially, India didn't seem to be in favor of the creation of the state of Israel in the way that it was created. The leader said that it was the Arabs that had the right over the land, but the position changed. It changed over time. It changed what looks like incrementally. But do you think that India's opposition to the creation of the State of Israel in 1947, 1948, was it ever sincere? And do you think even back then it was thought about in the same way as the creation of the State of India as a country for people of the Hindu religion?
Yeah, it's always difficult to conclude with a matter of certainty,
For sure.
over
Yeah.
some of these historical events, because there are ambiguities around many of the things that take place. And one thing for sure is that we have this understanding that India was pro-Palestine as a matter of certainty. Many people have that as a matter of certainty. But the point being now is that we've got to reconsider that as a point of certainty. Now, to the extent to which they were committed to it, the extent to which that they were sincere, the extent to which that they were committed is difficult to answer, because the Indian National Congress was an internationalist organization that cared about certain values, but they were also an organization that was very much upper caste Hindu in nature, and they were committed to establishing a state in which their dominance would not be eroded. So there's enough ambiguity there to make it clear that this was not an organization that was completely focused towards caste eradication or completely focused towards equality for Muslims, completely focused on creating a socialist state that would become egalitarian for everyone. So we have to move away from that, because that's what we understand about the Indian story, right? And so this is about creating or adding that layer of complexity that actually this was not the case. And the proof of that is that Gandhi was not great on caste, all right? And that many people in the Indian National Congress sort of moved between right-wing Hindu organizations as well as the Indian National Congress, all right? And that when the Muslim League spoke about trying to create spaces for Muslims to have some kind of autonomy, they did not initially talk about creating an entire separate state at the time. All they spoke about was a kind of federal solution in which Muslim majority areas in Punjab and Bengal, for instance, would have some level of autonomy so they don't get swallowed by this now created majority that just like some decades earlier or decades prior had become a majority, right? Because it was due to the British census that had created a Hindu majority, meaning that they not everyone even considered themselves Hindu, but if they were under this umbrella that was not Christian, not Muslim, and not Sikh, for instance, they would be planted under the banner of Hinduism, and that created this majority. And so Muslims were afraid that they would be swallowed by this majority, and Brahmins and upper caste Hindus wanted to keep their dominance because they would be at the top of the hierarchy of that of the category. So there was a lot of things going on, and Hindu nationalists, the sort of rabid Hindu nationalists who were the equivalent of a Jabotinsky, the revisionist Zionists in Palestine, they did not get the mileage. They did not get the space at that time to seem that they had a chance to dominate the country. And it was more about the British leaving the country to a set of elites that were British enough, but communal enough, Hindu nationalist enough, but also secular enough to continue, the project, essentially. And I can't remember your question now, to be honest, but the sincerity, the question about sincerity is that the Gandhi spoke about Palestine having been, belonging to the Arabs, belonging to Palestinians, and that they had a prior claim. But later, towards the end of his life, there are statements that he made that contradict that, and so we're not entirely sure what he thought at the end, right? The way Nehru treats Kashmir, for instance, is very colonial, and yet at the same time he talks about Palestine, being a place that belongs to the Palestinians as well. So there's a contradiction that then seeps into the consciousness of many left and secular Indians for decades to come, where they have this duality. They see Kashmir in one way and they see Palestine and other places in another way. Now, my final point regarding this is that no matter what they thought as a movement in the 20s and 30s, and no matter how sincere they may have been towards certain values, when India becomes a state in 1947, right? When partition takes place, it becomes a state. It becomes a state with interests. Then the state has to make decisions for its own interests. And that means that it then looks at this new state of Israel coming into being, and it looks at the Arab world and decides that, hey, we need oil, we need energy. So why would we compromise our energy resources and our relationship with the larger Arab world for this small Jewish state? We're not going to compromise on that. So the meaning that India's policy was not based primarily on some kind of sincerity or commitment to Palestine, but it was based on real politics. Like they wanted energy, so they didn't want to change it. Then they were considering the fact that they were opposed to the idea of Pakistan, right? And so why would they accept partition of another place so easily? So they didn't want to endorse the idea of partition so easily on the subcontinent. So they didn't want to, endorse a partition in Palestine. Then the third thing is that the occupation of Kashmir had started by then, and so the Arab world was aware of what was going on in Kashmir. And so India didn't want the Arab world to move towards Pakistan when it comes to the support of Kashmir, right? So these are decisions that were made for the interest of the state. And then when we think about how India then moves on in the following decades, and there are some examples, but I'll just focus on one right now, or two, is that in the early 60s, when India goes to war with China, if they were that committed to Palestine, then they would not have approached Israel to help them in a war with China. So they get weapons from Israel in 1962. And when they get those weapons, they actually ask David Ben-Gurion, the Prime Minister of Israel, to send those weapons in ships that are unmarked. That shows a very crass kind of duplicity on the Indian side. It's very pathetic when you think about it, right? But that's the level of the duplicity. Then in the late 60s, Indira Gandhi, rises, and she then sets up RAW, which is the Indian Foreign Intelligence Agency. And when she sets that up, she sets up direct relations between RAW and Mossad from her office. All right, and this is the same time and the same administration that then goes on to recognize the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. It welcomes Yasser Arafat, routinely to Delhi. All right, so it becomes a state that's playing both sides in a way. Now, of course, there might be a traditional, a commitment to the Palestinians that's there somewhere, but they're also looking after their own interests. So they're not going to take on Israel in any way. They're going to operate and cooperate. And then you can ask yourself, okay, fine. So why does it fall onto India then to make this kind of distinct kind of stance towards Israel? But if they present themselves as being totally pro-Palestinian, then how is it that they are working with Mossad, right? How is it that they are training their officers, That means that they are part of the occupation, that they are subsidizing it on a lower level, right? And then when India normalizes ties in the 90s, over the next 20 years, India becomes the biggest purchaser of Israeli weapons. Now, what is that, right? It becomes the biggest purchaser of Israeli weapons. When you purchase something, you are subsidizing the industry, all right? So it's not some benign exercise. If I'm trading with you, right, I'm helping you, all right? And if I'm trading with you on weapons, I'm helping your military-industrial complex, all right? And it means I'm endorsing your military-industrial complex. I'm now complicit in the work that you do with the money that you are earning from those sales, right? So in a way, India has tried to position itself that it still cares about Palestinian statehood, it still cares about Palestinian rights, but it actually has now become a case of like them offering charity to the Palestinians, like there's $2-3 million, build a camp, build a school, build a little medical center, and then purchasing $1.8 billion worth of weapons from Israel, and then producing those weapons in India as well, and selling them to the rest of the world. Like it's an absolute travesty, and it's also an absolute mockery of solidarity as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And before you were talking about the fact that India is known as, or maybe even self-declares itself as the biggest democracy in the world, and Israel does the same as being, like one of the best democracies in the world. And
The
so
only democracy in the Middle East.
oh yes, that's the line that Israel takes. And so Israel especially will say, yeah, because look, we're so supportive of the LGBTQ community. Everybody can vote, etc., etc. And they talk about all these freedoms and liberties, so to speak. And India, and I think that is our idea of a democracy, that if you live in a democracy, everybody is free, you have a free press, you have your minorities are not persecuted, everybody can vote, and you have free and fair elections. But obviously, that isn't. I don't understand how you can be a democracy if you're an occupier, if you're a colonial project. But one of the things that is happening in India is that the press is being severely targeted and censored. And also there is a huge attack on minority communities. So we've seen it in India with Muslims, and also with Punjabi Sikhs as well. So I wondered, because I do feel like this isn't something that is talked about massively. I wondered if you could just spend a little bit of time just talking about the human rights abuses that are happening in India, and why it's so important in understanding sort of what that's trying to achieve.
So when we think about human rights violations in India, or what has been going on, especially over the past decade, it's important to remember that India has never been a full-on democracy. It has never been a full-on secular state. And there have been periodic attacks on Muslims, periodic attacks on Christians, as well as Sikhs, even Dalits as well. And so it's always been an upper caste state that has, focused on dominating, the so-called minorities in India. And, as you rightly pointed out yourself, there's been an occupation taking place from the late 40s in Kashmir. From the 50s, there have been special laws in places like the northeast of India, in which the army is able to act with impunity, and they're not liable. They don't need to be held accountable, because these zones are called disturbed areas, right, quote unquote. And so you've also seen several governments prior to the Modi government, exercising immense violence on communities to kind of get them to vote for them, right? And so they go and cause some chaos in a community, and then they'll come in and support the majority in that community, and then that community then leans on the party to support them, and it becomes very clear how it is that you will survive in a place, right, if you support a particular party, right? And so the important thing I hope your listeners will get out of this is that this is not a question about Modi only. Modi is taking the country to another place, but that place is recognizable to a large extent to many people who have been under the butt of the gun, or under the butt of an army officer, under the boot of an army officer rather, and what's been going on in the past 10 years, and it's going to be 10 years this year since Modi became Prime Minister in 2014, is that under Narendra Modi, India has been moving towards becoming a full-on Hindu nationalist state. They call it a Hindu Rashtra. And the point being here is that they are following this idea, or this ideology called Hindutva. And Hindutva is a concept like Zionism that believes that this place is meant to be for one people, so there'll be one religion, one language, one culture, one nation, one way of doing things, all right? And that if you don't fall within the ambit of that religion, if you're not Hindu, right? In the case of India and in the case of Israel, you're not Jewish, right? Then you are an outsider, right? You are a traitor to that place, just by definition, just by the definition of being Muslim or being Palestinian, right? You're an outsider, and you need to be disciplined. You need to be subjugated. You need to submit basically to the majority, and that has now seen. So this has manifested itself in kind of laws that outlaw eating beef in places, right? Uh, it has seen kind of people being lynched for just transporting animals, right? And just on the suspicion of transporting cows, for instance, you could be murdered, right? You could be killed on the streets. Then there's been all these other campaigns like Love Jihad, like the idea being that this falls into like the paranoia of the ethno-nationalist imagination, right? In which they believe that they're going to be outbred by Muslims, and that there's this structural policy towards converting everyone in India to Islam, right? And so, if you are a man who falls in love with a Hindu woman, they call it love jihad, and they are now accusing you of trying to lure or seduce Hindu women with the purpose of converting them, and you could be lynched for that. And then there's other things that have been taking place in especially states like UP and Uttar Pradesh, or in Bihar, for instance, in which if you are living in a Muslim-like neighborhood, you would have people coming in, as they do in some of the Palestinian towns and villages, where people come in and kind of like mock Muslims, go into the mosque and sort of like desecrate the place, come in and start chanting like Hindu slogans, Hindu religious slogans, coming and disturbing you while it's like the fasting period, whether it's Ramadan, for instance, coming and intimidating and provoking, the community. And if you respond in any way, whether you throw a stone back or whether you respond physically or you respond verbally, as in going and speaking to the media, for instance, you'll be picked up and then arrested and held and detained, and you might find that your house is sort of like demolished afterwards. So there's a lot of like so-called passive aggressive kind of attacks on the Muslim community, which makes it very clear in certain areas that they do not belong or that they shouldn't get too comfortable, essentially. And so many Muslims are feeling like second-class citizens in these places. Now, in places like Kashmir as well, you've had new laws coming into place in which Indians are now, following the events of 2019 when Kashmir lost its semi-autonomous status, you have a situation now where Indians can go to Kashmir and become residents and buy up land. And the idea there is that you can kind of like attempt to change the demography of the place, in which then it'll be no longer a Muslim majority place, it'll be possibly a Hindu majority. And then you have elections, and then you kind of vote out the dispute in a way to say that there's no issue here anymore. Everyone's happy with India. Now, likewise, that there are other communities who are also targeted. You have Dalits as well, who are also targeted in a matter of their diet. You have Sikhs who are targeted because they are seen to be part of the Khalistan movement, looking for a separate homeland for themselves in Punjab. And this has also seen kind of transnational attacks taking place, in which a lot of the activism may have moved to the UK or to the US, and many of these diaspora communities are actually not safe there either, in which these foreign intelligence agencies are now working in these places. They're targeting them, and there have been assassinations, and it's endless essentially. So India is moving in a very, very dangerous direction, and it's been buoyed by the support that it gets by the Biden administration. And it also gets a lot of support from the UK government as well, obviously. And now with its relationship with Israel, it kind of joined this kind of elite Western club in a way, in which it can disguise its activities under the banner of defending itself. So everything is about, I'm defending my country, I'm defending my nation from these outsiders, by these crazy Muslims, by these crazy Sikhs who want to separate. Everything is about us being attacked, essentially. So there's an immense psychosis regarding that, where there's this fantasy of being attacked all the time is instrumentalized for you to conduct attacks, essentially, and for you to dominate. And so that's where we are.
So just listening to you speak, I mean, that was very interesting. I mean, a lot of which, unfortunately, I have been watching the developments in India over the last few years, especially with so much fear, because I don't know what's going to happen to Muslim communities, especially in India, and just seeing the ways in which people are, as you've described as well, being lynched and being denied access to certain spaces. I can kind of see the attack on hijab that can kind of come with that and all kinds of stuff. So it's very, very scary. And it definitely is something that we should not be turning away from. I mean, especially for a country that prides itself on being democratic. But you were talking about in Kashmir, the fact that Article 370 was revoked, which has now given non-Kashmiris the ability to buy land in Kashmir, and basically how that is very systematically a way of changing population. And I think the reason why that is so important is because Kashmir is at some point entitled to a vote to decide the fate of its own position, I guess, or sovereignty. I don't know what the right, because I don't think it will ever be given a vote for its own freedom, but just having some choice about who it is administered or governed by. But I was thinking a lot about how this change in population is exactly how occupation and colonialism works, and we have seen it play out in Israel and in Palestine. So initially, when the state of Israel was created, it was majority Palestinian. Palestine was, there was a majority of Palestinian community living in that country, and yet still Israel was given the majority of the land. And what they have done over time is change the population by forcing out Palestinians and bringing in people from outside, Jewish people from other countries, which is what has changed the demographic. And so eventually they can say well, no, this is our land and this is a land for our people. And I think one of my favorite parts of your book is actually chapter 5, which you've called a story of two occupations, Kashmir and Palestine. And I wondered if you could just take a moment just to reflect a little bit more on why these two are so similar. Almost how, you've talked about it a lot already, how in India is almost learning from Israel and Zionism about how to act in Kashmir to have more control over it. But I think it's really important, and it isn't something that we think that much about. But Kashmir is heavily militarized. I think it's isn't there an army personnel for every 10 citizens or something? It's heavily militarized. One of the most militarized zones in the world, and I think the only other one is Gaza. So yeah, I just wondered if you could reflect a little bit on this story of these two occupations.
Yeah, sure. So the story, when it comes to Kashmir and Palestine, and some people are interested in this. I believe not enough people are aware of Kashmir, as you have pointed out as well, and kind of the similarities between Kashmir and Palestine. And this is not to say that they are the same, and it's never meant to mean that, right? When we think about apartheid in Israel, right, and the way Israel operates as an apartheid state, we don't mean that it's exactly like South Africa, but there are elements, that replicate the South African model, the South African apartheid model. And apartheid, when it comes to the Israeli context, is only, one arm of a larger settler colonial project, right? It's just one element of it, one tool, right? One tactic. Yeah. And one of the first things I think it's important to know about Kashmir and Palestine is that both of them start off at almost the same time, and I don't mean that there isn't a story that predates 47, 48, but in terms of, these two countries that are created, right? There's a partition that takes place in the subcontinent. Pakistan is created. You have a partition of Palestine. The state of Israel comes into being in 48. And both these questions are one of the earliest questions at the United Nations. And both of these questions have not been resolved, right? That's one of the first things. The second thing is that you have a Nakba that takes place, in the late 40s, 47, 48, 49, 50, around that period, in which 750,000 Palestinians are expelled and several thousand are also killed. And these Palestinians, have become refugees in all these different places, including Gaza, in which they're now being made into refugees again, or they're being, obviously killed. But there's also a major massacre that takes place in Jammu around 47, in which historians say around 200,000 Muslims were killed, another 500,000 or so were displaced, and many of whom were pushed into Pakistan. And that's when a demographic change takes place in Jammu, for instance. That's one of the first elements of that. So when people think about demographic change in Kashmir, Kashmiris will talk about the demographic change that took place in Jammu, in which that changed to a Hindu majority in 47. Now, since 47, since 48, you have these occupations that begin, and some form of settler colonial project that starts. And you have the Indian army in Kashmir, you have the Israeli militia or the Jewish militia that becomes the Israeli army and starts taking over places in Palestine. And since that time, you have, this idea that of tactics that are very similar. And there's this tactics of collective punishment, right, that the Israelis and Indians use. There's also the tactic of maiming protesters, right? So they would shoot Palestinians in the legs and render them disabled. Later on, Kashmiris would be shot in the eyes and be blinded, right, with pellets. You've had also the destruction of homes without any kind of judicial sort of oversight, just completely, destroying people's properties. You've had the refusal to return bodies of fighters, right? And so not even giving the dignity to those resistance fighters. You've had the criminalization of civil society and journalism. And so these are tactics that they've shared for quite a while. Now, in terms of one of the differences, sort of not full-on difference, is that Israel has always looked upon the Palestinians as a people that they want to destroy, or as a people that they want to annihilate, or people they want to push out. India has looked on to Kashmiris as a people they've tried to assimilate. So they have, they gave them passports, they gave them freedom of movement in terms of the rest of India, right? But that has never worked. That development that India has brought into Kashmir has never moved Kashmiris to feel that they want to be part of this place. And so the tactic now has shifted, in which they're now taking on the sort of Zionist model, in which they are happy to isolate them, to take over, to conduct more demographic change, to create more checkpoints, to create more difficulties with travel, to kind of go in and just take over spaces of land or property without much sort of oversight, right? So they've also started using Israeli tactics of creating fences on the border with Pakistan as well, with sensors. They've also gone in and started using these sort of counterinsurgency operations of building in major major collaborator networks in Kashmir as well, in which it becomes a very policed state where everyone's watching each other and everyone's sort of like reporting and telling on each other. So it becomes a very, very paranoid space. One of the differences is that Israel has also had an approach that differs to India in that whereas India is a lot more sort of like subtle or very much shy to do things in the open. It'll cut the internet, it'll cut the electricity, it'll cut telephone lines, it'll do things in the dark. Israel is very much into the idea of a spectacle. And so its military industrial complex is also designed and sort of contingent on the spectacle so it can sell weapons to other places. So it's a laboratory to show others, this is how, watch how we deal with these people. This is how we govern this lot. And I think slowly we're going to see India taking on that model as well, where it'll also become open to the spectacle in Kashmir, where it'll be a lot more bold but because it's not something that they have done in which they would do something for the world to see kind of thing. But as they become more emboldened, that might change as well, in which if Kashmiris start fighting, if the armed resistance starts again, and India then brings on this Israeli model of like self-defense, right? Then they are going to go into Kashmir and be very, very harsh with Kashmiris. They're going to be very, very violent for the world to see. So these are kind of the things that are shifting as well on the ground.
That's really interesting, because I think that what kind of gives strength to Israel's actions in terms of how it is justified is that there is a history of persecution and there is an argument of self-defense that keeps on being brought forward. I mean, it's completely null and void, really, but it's there and it's very loud. And it will be interesting to see if India is able to adapt something similar. And I think what is interesting, I mean, Rashid Khalidi talks about this as well, is that Israel, that usually like a colonial project, is a form of expansion. So you have a mother country that is occupying in order to expand in one way or another. And we have that with India and Kashmir, I guess, to an extent. But we don't have that in the state of Israel. There was no quote unquote mother country, because you just had a Jewish population in Europe or wherever that was being persecuted that then wanted a home. So you don't have expansion in the same way. So obviously, like the situations are not the same, but it's very interesting to see how India is, I guess, in some ways potentially learning from Israel, and that there are similarities, and you write about this in the book as well, between Hindutva and Zionism, which cannot be ignored. And I think if you listen closely enough, it's quite apparent. And also, obviously, the situation in Kashmir, the Kashmiris will tell you how devastating and how scary it is. I have from my husband's family in Kashmir, and so we know the kind of issues that they face with freedom of movement and the lack of having access to food, issues with internet and technology, and load shedding, so the reduction of electricity. But I do think that, as you said, like, it is very covert, it's not something that a lot of people will know about. It's not something that India is making a spectacle about. So thank you. That's a really very interesting. It's given me a lot to think about, really. And we have been speaking for a really long time. I would happily continue, but I do know that we have to stop. So just to end, what was your experience of writing this book, and what do you hope that it will achieve? What do you hope for anyone that picks it up?
So thank you for the question. It was difficult to write because, a lot of Indian historiography underplays the role of the Indian state when it comes to regional politics, when it comes to sort of really analyzing how the Indian state has conducted itself with its minorities as well. So there's this perception of the Indian state, and then there's the reality of the Indian state, and then and it's like that for many places and many countries, right? But there's a kind of exceptionalism that exists when it comes to talking about India, and even today, even as India becomes so close to Israel and becomes so aligned to the West on many things, I mean, except this Russia story, right? And that's also a bit more complicated because it's not actually necessarily neutral, right? It's actually making money out of its supposed neutrality. It's selling Russian oil and it's doing all kinds of things. But the point being is that there's a lot of hubris that I had to go through, and to a lot of things that I had to unpack to try and push back against the accepted narratives regarding India's foreign policy. And that took a lot of time to do. And a lot of the work that has been done on India and Israel, for instance, has been written from the perspective of the Indian state and the Israeli state and neoliberal international relations scholarship, in that the idea being that India and Israel being close is actually good for India, it's good for Israel, it's good for the world in a way. But that's also really problematic because, as we know, scholarship is not unbiased, right? And the scholarship is actually meant to assist businesses and authoritarians to actually become closer to each other. It's not actually geared towards helping people or helping people's movements or helping fix the environment. These relationships, between these authoritarian states have major implications for the environment. It has major implications for people everywhere, for indigenous movements everywhere. And as I said to you, that India and Israel have become models for places elsewhere. That's the key part here, is that we have I'm hoping that people will pick up the book and look at how, narratives are made to sell a particular type of story. Meanwhile, they are actually conducting themselves in a very dangerous manner. And I'm also hoping that people pick up that these tactics are very similar. They're actually quite old. They're very colonial in nature. And so it's not hard to guess the direction that they will go next. And so that should give people some optimism that they can tackle these things. But we've got to stop pretending that it's only the US and these other places, Western places, that are the villains in all of this. We've got to start recognizing that it comes in all kinds of shades as well.
Absolutely.
And I think that's where I'll end off.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Azad. It has been really wonderful speaking to you on the show today.
No, thank you so much, Samia. I really appreciate it.
If you enjoyed the show, please follow The Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice. Like, subscribe, and leave a review, as it really helps people find the show. Also, I would really appreciate it if you could help me continue to put amazing episodes like this out. Come and find me on Patreon, patreon.com/The Diverse Bookshelf Podcast.